Hi everybody, Professor Kauser here. Just going to give a bit of a video lecture to talk mainly about China. Most of what I would say is pretty well covered in the textbook chapter, so do make sure that you read that carefully. But just to highlight a few themes that are in that chapter and maybe a couple things that aren't, just to sort of put China in the perspective of some of the other things we're looking at here. China is in many ways rather like Europe or rather like India in some respects. It's better in some ways not to think of it as a country, but as a very large region. There's a lot of different linguistic dialects in China. There are a lot of different ethnic groups. It's geographically vast, has many different ecosystems and economies going on within it, and so you're really an enormous diverse area, which you really need to focus on, perhaps rather than thinking of one big unitary Chinese culture. It's not technically geographically a subcontinent like Europe or India are, but in some ways kind of behaves that way. Unlike Europe or India, much more of Chinese history features the predominance of large unified Chinese empires under various dynasties through its history, whereas Europe, of course, tends to be politically divided for most of its history, as does India. China has a much longer standing tradition of unity, sort of as a succession of dynasties from the Han to the Tang to the Song to the Yuan to the Ming and so forth. So the sort of succession of dynasties does give Chinese history a bit more coherence than you have perhaps in some other areas, but still you need to remember we are dealing with a vast area with an enormous population and a lot of diversity of various ethnicities, cultures, languages, and so forth. A couple of things which are worth drawing attention to when we think about Chinese culture. One, in terms of its political philosophy, one very important foundational idea in Chinese history is something called the Mandate of Heaven, which is a document that goes back to the Han Dynasty, back between 200 BC and 200 AD, the dynasty that ruled China about the same time as you had the Roman Empire in the ancient West. The Mandate of Heaven is a version of what we call parallel sovereignty, the idea being that you have a supreme supernatural power ruling the universe, and then you have a supreme earthly power ruling the earth. And it really is conceived as the supreme political authority on earth who rules in parallel to the supernatural cosmic power of the divinity. You see versions of this in the Roman Empire, you see versions of this in ancient Persia. The Byzantine Empire had something like it, a Christian version of it. It is different from the idea of the divine right of kings, because the idea of divine right of kings that we had in last week's readings did not include the idea that the monarch is supreme ruler of the entire world, right? Under divine right of kings, you can have a King of France, who is the divinely appointed king of that kingdom. You can have a separate absolute monarch of England, another one of Spain, another one of someplace else. Each of them has their authority by divine right, but there's not a pretense that their authority extends over the entire world. In parallel sovereignty, including the Chinese Mandate of Heaven, that is, however, very much the idea. All other rulers on earth have to be treated as subordinates to the ruler of China, even if they don't actually live under direct Chinese administrations. Okay, that's how the Mandate of Heaven works. The other component to it is that it does have a kind of a cosmic element. The emperor occupies a ritual role, a ceremonial role, which places him as the link between earth and heaven, which not only grants him authority, but also means an understanding that the proper adherence of the emperor to his role is, his need to supply justice and rule well and be benevolent, guarantees the well-being of the kingdom, and indeed the well-being of nature itself, right? A sort of, the weather will be favorable, the crops will be fertile, all things will go well, there won't be diseases and disasters, as long as the emperor rules correctly and justly, in his role as the link in the chain between earth and heaven. Again, not an idea you particularly have in parallel sovereignty. I mean, that you particularly have in Western absolutism, necessarily. You don't always have this notion that that if a famine happens, it must go back to the emperor having ruled incorrectly somehow, behaved unjustly or inappropriately or something like that, right? So Mandate have a very strong set of ideas related to other things you see in other cultures as ways of connecting religion to political authority, but it's a distinctly Chinese form of it. Okay, another feature of Chinese society to bear in mind is that if we think of it in terms of a religion and worldview, you also have a great deal of diversity, naturally owing to the large diverse population. A variety of practices. There is a belief in a fairly traditional pantheon of multiple Chinese gods. When you look at the Zheng He inscription, for example, that we looked at back in our very first inscription, he's devoting his voyages to a particular goddess, which is significant there. There's also a prominent idea of ancestor worship in Chinese society, where one's ancestors are understood to have gone on into an afterlife, into the world of heaven, into the world of the gods, and therefore they are the family's natural mediators between the living family members and the gods and divine powers of the universe. So you sort of cultivate the memory of your ancestors, you pray to your ancestors on the understanding that they are the ones who are sort of looking out for you in the high places of the cosmos, so to speak. So that's a prominent element. There are also other philosophies. Buddhism, which had originated in India, had entered China in ancient times and had won a great many adherents, and you get a number of Chinese forms of Buddhism practiced by various people. There's also a more indigenous Chinese philosophy called Taoism, which is a fairly significant component of Chinese society. And then also, perhaps particularly important for our purposes, is the philosophy known as Confucianism, after the ancient Chinese thinker Kong-Fu-Tzu, whose name is often rendered into Western languages as Confucius. Confucius had a philosophy which was built on this Chinese conception of the order of the universe, which is also reflected in ancestor worship and in the Mandate of Heaven. He was very much concerned with ethics and with the proper way for a person to behave as a sort of a superior gentleman, as a cultivated gentleman in society. This entails a number of things, one of which is a respect for hierarchy, a sort of an understanding of an ordered society and everyone having their place in it, but also an ethic of self-denial and benevolence and service within that hierarchy so that everybody understands how they contribute to the good of the whole, right? From the emperor performing his rights and his functions to provide justice and mediate the divine to people, down to everybody else down the rest of the chain. And Confucius's idea is that, in a sense, because of the hierarchical structure of the cosmos, as he understands it, everything under heaven in its proper order, if those higher up in the order practice benevolence in their exercise of their role, then that will automatically lead to, or more or less automatically, sort of the power of example and the power of ceremony will lead those lower in the hierarchy to also behave properly, fulfill their roles correctly, and this will lead to a harmonious kind of a society. Okay, so in Confucianism, very much a very optimistic kind of a philosophy when you think about it. It's not so much something which is saying people are evil and need to be sort of disciplined and have, rules set for them and be punished for breaking them, but rather the emphasis in Confucianism much more on the power of moral example and the confidence that a correctly ordered society will result from benevolent, positive behavior by those at the top of the hierarchy. Another feature of Confucianism, a very major tenet of its morals, is a principle called filial piety. This being the sense of duty and devotion within a family from children towards their parents, or particularly sons towards their fathers. The idea in Confucianism being that this is the most fundamental and basic social tie upon which all other social connections depend, right? You sort of begin in the family, you begin with parents and children. And if the son shows proper respect and devotion and obedience to his father, then that will create a bond of filial piety, which again will sort of emanate out from the family and replicate itself in all kinds of other relationships, political political relationships and economic relationships will also show this kind of devotion and appropriate behavior towards one another. So filial piety, central Confucian tenet. And then the other thing, finally, in Confucianism is the idea that education, that training is also an important feature of the superior gentleman in Chinese society. And therefore, what you see developing over the centuries of Chinese history is a very important institution called the examination system. Students would be trained extensively in the classics of Confucian literature, the writings of Confucius himself and some of the other early Confucian thinkers. And then they would have an extremely, sort of when they reach the conclusion of their studies, they would have an extremely high-stakes final exam, so to speak, in which if a person performed well in the examination, their score could entitle them to positions in imperial service. You might become a local postman, you might become a local scribe or dignitary or tax collector, something of that kind, if your score was sort of moderately good, ranging up to people becoming qualified to move into ranks as relatively high government officials, treasurers, advisors, this kind of thing, if they scored extremely well. So the examination system being an important element in Chinese society, because like other societies, Chinese society is agricultural and hierarchical. You have a noble class of powerful, wealthy landholders who tend to dominate society. But the Confucian examination system, although many of the people who went into it already came from wealthy, privileged families, it could also operate as a means of social advancement for people from lower families, right? If you came from a relatively poor family, but managed to get get yourself an education, did well, studied hard, worked hard, did well in the exam, you could potentially move up quite a bit. So you have a lot of respect for education and for its possibility to promote a family's fortunes in Chinese society. So that's an important element there. Okay, so much, that's sort of quick overview of a few basic elements in Chinese culture we should be aware of. In terms of Chinese history leading into the early modern era, at the dawn of the early modern period, we're about the middle of the reign of the Ming dynasty in China. The Ming had come to power in 1368, and the conditions of their coming to power are very important to understand early modern China. The dynasty before the Ming had been the Yuan dynasty, Y-U-A-N, and the Yuan dynasty had been a dynasty of Mongols. They had originated with Genghis Khan, or Genghis Khan as the name is sometimes rendered, who had built an enormous, powerful coalition of nomads on the plains of Mongolia and had led a series of brilliant military campaigns which resulted in some of the world's greatest conquests ever, which were then continued under his sons and under his grandsons. Genghis Khan and the Mongols not only expanded their power from Mongolia, they conquered first the northern half of China and then eventually the entirety of China, which had been ruled by the Song dynasty previously, so they brought all of China under their rule. And they also extended their empire westwards. They conquered out, sort of following the Silk Road, out into Central Asia, reaching places like Tashkent and Samarkand and these Silk Road merchant cities, powerful merchant cities. They got into the Middle East, where they conquered Persia and got to Baghdad, sacked that in 1258. I think when we talked about the Muslims, we talked about some of the impact of Mongol conquests in the Middle East. And a bit earlier than that, in the 1240s, they were also moving into Eastern Europe, where they conquered what would eventually become Russia, and even launched some devastating attacks on Poland and Hungary, although they didn't stick around to permanently conquer those areas. So what all this meant was that by the time you get to about 1260 or so, you had this massive Mongol Empire, which extended in the west from the Middle East and Eastern Europe all the way across Central Asia to the Pacific Ocean and the coast of China. This had been very significant for a number of things. One was that it allowed for travel much more readily across the entire length of the Silk Road. The Silk Road had existed since ancient times, but almost never did any one person travel the entire length of it. Most of the silk trade was carried in stages. You know, a Chinese merchant would make it out to Central Asia, a Central Asian merchant would make it to the Middle East, a Middle Eastern merchant would make it to Europe. You know, you have multiple stages that way. But under the Mongol Empire, it became much more feasible for a person to get off a ship, say, on the Black Sea, in the Caucasus area, and then travel the entire length of the empire until they arrived in China. The most famous person to have made this journey was Marco Polo, but he wasn't the only one, and there was a number of expeditions for trade and diplomacy and missionary activity going back and forth across the entire length of the Mongol Empire, say around year, 1260, 1280, 1300, 1320, sort of leading to a much broader understanding and a lot of excitement in places like Europe and the Middle East about sort of what's out there in the rest of the world and in the Far East. The Mongol Empire eventually broke up after 1300. It started being partitioned among the descendants of Genghis Khan and then started breaking up further from there. In China, you had a lot of resentment against the rule of the Mongols. The Mongols had conquered China. They proclaimed themselves as a new Chinese dynasty, the Yuan dynasty, and tried to rule China as the Chinese expected to be ruled, but they had a lot of difficulties with doing it over the long run. They weren't really coming out of a very literate culture that understood all the nuances and all the sophistication involved in administering a massive empire as China was, and as China had been accustomed to do. Things like the administration, like the taxation system, like the justice system, all were rather complicated, and they wound up oversimplifying things, and in the process offending a great many Chinese. There was in the interest of maintaining their own sort of superiority and dominance over the Chinese, they passed a number of laws which aggressively discriminated against Chinese and gave a lot of privileges to Mongols. If a person committed a crime, a Chinese person would be punished much more severely than a Mongol would. Things like that. A lot of the taxation, rather than try to run it directly themselves, they would farm it out to people with more of a background in literacy from other parts of their empire. A lot of Muslims were brought into China doing this, coming out of sort of Central Asia, places like Samarkand, a lot of Turkmen and Uyghurs and people like that, who would be brought in, who would then be sort of, profiteering off the rulers, making them responsible for the tax collection, and this in turn provoked a lot of resentment on the part of the Chinese towards them. So a lot of this kind of thing going on. This all spurred a great deal of Chinese resentment, and by the time you get into the 1330s, 1340s, you're seeing some pretty widespread Chinese revolts against Mongol rule, culminating in 1368 with the sort of all these coming together, and what's called the Red Turban Rebellion, finally driving the Mongols out of China, conquering Beijing, which had been the center of their Chinese administration, and forcing the Mongols to return back north to Mongolia. The leader of the Red Turbans then pronounced himself, Taitsu, pronounced himself the first ruler of a new dynasty, the Ming dynasty, and that's where this Ming dynasty comes from, starting in 1368, and is going to rule down into the 1600s. The Ming really built their rule in some ways in response to Mongol rule, and in some ways wound up setting up problems of their own in a number of ways. One was that the Ming really had originated out of a peasant revolt for the most part. They hadn't come out of the intelligentsia or the Confucian classes in society, and so they really didn't turn to that resource as much, and their own administration in some ways did not initially completely, just go back to the full sophistication and nuance that you had back under, say, the Song dynasty or the Tang dynasty earlier. So there's a fair amount of mismanagement going on right there, and some coldness, I guess you could say, between the Confucian classes and the people actually running the palace. That would be one area. Although the Ming do start bringing back the examination system that the Mongols had neglected and start a bit of a Confucian revival there. But it won't be till the Qing dynasty later that that really happens. There are other things where, for example, in the taxation system, like I said, the Mongols had promoted these foreigners who had then been very much despised and feared and hated by the Chinese. And so the Ming dynasty decides to try and develop a new policy to alleviate the burden of taxation and the difficulties with foreign tax collectors. So the Ming rulers try having each village send its own tax assessment to the treasury. Okay, in other words, rather than some outsider tax collector coming in and bullying people around and squeezing everybody as hard as they can for money, instead you're going to generously allow the villagers to figure out for themselves how to come up with their tax assessment, who's going to pay how much, and transport it to the court. Which is all very well, except for the fact that China is a very big place and some villages are much, much, much farther away from the court than others are, which means that when they, set out to get their taxes delivered to the treasury, it's much more expensive and much more difficult and dangerous for them to make the journey, right? Travel is dangerous, there are bandits, there are brigands, there are accidents that can happen due to weather, you might need to hire guards or have other kinds of extra expenses, not to mention just the food and housing while you're traveling, things like that, which means that for a lot of the outlying areas, trying to pay your taxes winds up actually being more burdensome and more resented under the Ming than it had been under the Yuan, where at least you had a professional coming around and doing it on his own dime. Now all the villagers, the peasants, are really feeling the pressure to try and deliver the tax assessments. And then when there are shortfalls, when people don't pay or don't get their payments delivered, the court tends to react with a kind of paranoia, a sort of a sense that there's some sort of conspiracy or rebellion out there that's preventing people from virtuously, performing their duty and presenting the taxes that they ought to the treasury. And so you wind up getting a lot of court intrigue, you wind up getting a lot of suspicion, a lot of people being accused, you get purges where people are being arrested and executed, and sort of a lot of this kind of thing, which again leads to a lot of mismanagement and resentment against the ruler. So Ming Dynasty does not bring in a kind of a Chinese golden age, even though they drove out the hated Mongols. They still are facing a lot of problems, some of them really of their own creation in some senses. The other thing, which is another aspect partly related to this origin in driving out the Mongols, is that the Ming Dynasty has a more inward-looking tendency, so a set of policies. The exception to this is Zheng He, who is a courtier, very significant man at the Ming court, who on his own initiative and sort of on his own organization creates these great tribute fleets of Chinese vessels which sail out into the Pacific Ocean and around into the Indian Ocean. We saw those back in Chapter 1 and sort of show the flag in a sense and really make a Chinese presence around a lot of Eurasia very widely known. That's between about 1400 and 1420 or so. But that's very much a personal project of Zheng He's that he's able to talk the emperor into, not really taking root more deeply in Ming culture. And when Zheng He dies, the fleets pretty much get scrapped and nobody really continues this idea of having an extensive Chinese presence on the ocean. It's one of those great counterfactuals of history, one of those great what-if scenarios. What if this idea of Zheng He's had been picked up, had become standing Chinese policy. And when Europeans start getting out and exploring the Americas and exploring the Indian Ocean, what if they had encountered Chinese fleets who were just as ambitious and just as aggressive as they were? You might have had a very different shape of world history moving forward through the 1500s and 1600s, but that's not how it happened. So you get the sort of inward-looking thing. The Great Wall of China is actually the other great symbol of this sort of inward-looking defensive fortress mentality, trying to exclude the world. There had been a wall or a set of fortifications and defenses across the north of China going back into ancient times, going back to about 220 BC or so, back in the days of the Qin dynasty. But it's really the Ming dynasty that revives the idea of the wall, that builds it up, and that gives it its current form, this sort of massive architectural thing that you can see from space. That is very much a Ming project and very much symbolizes this Ming assertion of Chinese superiority and rejection of the outsider, rejection of the Mongol, sort of all kind of xenophobic, almost kind of attitude. And so again, when you look at Chinese society, compared to older dynasties like the Tang and the Song, you see less interest in China in bringing in ideas, bringing in trade from the outside world and things like that. They don't totally batten down the hatches and exclude the outside world. It's not Japan, which does precisely that. But there's just not that much interest at court in cultivating trade connections, or diplomatic connections, or other kinds of connections with the outside world, or bringing in ideas. It's very much sort of a China for the Chinese kind of approach here, which, again, is going to mean that China is going to sort of, under the Ming, stand in a fairly static kind of a position at the same time as Europeans are getting out in the rest of the world and doing lots of exploring and trading and conquering. Very little Chinese activity to correspond to that. Okay, so those are just a few themes I want to highlight, focusing on China there. Japan also features, but I won't worry about Japan too much in this chapter. But pay attention to those themes as you're looking at the chapter. There's other material there that I didn't cover, and I'll look forward to seeing everybody's comments on the boards. Thank you.